Lorraine O'Dwyer from gallivanting.ie, stories from the Fireside.
Go for it.
Hello, good morning. Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks. Stay on there. Yeah. Right. Hello, everybody. Hello, and thank you for joining me on this cold, wet night. Sit down there now by the fire and make yourself comfortable. So the story I'm going to be telling tonight was originally recorded in the Leabhar de Bád Éireann, which literally translates as the Book of the Taking of Ireland. It's better known in English, though, as the Book of Invasions. And it's a collection of poems and prose narratives in the Irish language, and it's meant to be a history of Ireland and the Irish from the creation of the world all the way up to the Middle Ages. And there's a few versions. The earliest of them was compiled by an anonymous writer in the 11th century. But it's long and convoluted, and to tell the Book of Invasions in one sitting would probably take well over a week, with breaks in between to tell you the different variations. And you'd still run into trouble with historians and academics who differ on interpretations or translations. So the original tales, well, they're written in very old Irish, and they're written on vellum pages, which are missing bits here and there. Timelines are a bit blurry, names are repeated, and deeds listed in one manuscript are assigned to another in another manuscript, or just simply left out altogether. But as a storyteller, it's my job to take a piece here, a piece there, retelling from another storyteller, or translation I made myself, and knit it all together until it becomes a tale worth inviting you to sit down here and listen to. And in the greatest of Irish traditions as well, the tradition of the Seanachai, it is a teaching tale, meant to sit with you for long after, to linger in your mind and slowly seep down into that soul of yours, hopefully stirring an interest in hearing some more stories, be it from me, another storyteller, or even just hunting down a book or two to read some more. And so, without any waffle about the makings of the story, we shall begin. So the first part of the story is the oldest. It's said to be about 5,000 years old, which puts it at the end of the Stone Age. Obviously, being so old, it's lost some of the bits and pieces over the years. So this is what's been pieced together. It doesn't make much sense, not logically anyway, but that story's for you. But it tells the story of the very first people to come to Ireland, and they were led by a woman called Ceasair. When she was coming of age, Ceasair was taken out by her foster father for a bit of a chat. He was a priest in Egypt, and he told her that she needed to gather together a group, that they needed to set out in order that they might escape a coming flood, a flood that would cleanse the world of all evils. She don't know what Ceasair thought of what she was hearing, but she did what she was told, and she got 3 huge big canoes carved out of cedar trees. She gathered together 150 women. No men, but 150 women. And she found all the ones that she could find that had skills of their own. So skilled warriors, skilled hunters, wood carvers, medicine women, those gifted with the knowledge of farming and animal husbandry. Now, Ceasair was not the only one building boats at that time. I'm sure you all have heard of the great Noah. Well, Ceasair's father approached Noah looking for a space on the ark, but he was turned down. And so Bith, along with his 2 sons, Fintan and Laura, went back to Ceasair and asked her, would she take them to safety? And she said she would, as long as they'd acknowledge her as the leader. I believe Bith found this quite difficult, but he did anyway. And when the skies began to darken and the rains began to fall, and the day came at last that they needed to set sail, Ceasair set sail with 150 women, 3 men, her father and her 2 brothers. Now, the journey, by all accounts, was not easy. It was very difficult. Stormy weather beset them the whole time they were out sailing. But eventually they managed to make their way to Inishfall, the Isle of Destiny, the place her foster father had told her about. And the reason why they were coming here was because this place had never been populated by man or woman, and so therefore it had no sin on it, and so therefore it would be safe from the floodwaters. Makes sense, right? Now where they landed is up for debate. Some say it was Kerry, but I believe it was where the three waters meet, down near New Ross and Kilkenny, where the rivers the Suir, the Nore and the Barrow meet. Wherever it was anyway, when they arrived, the island that they arrived on was very different to the island we live on today. First of all, Ireland back then was a temperate rainforest, and so it was covered in thick forests. Ancient oaks and ash and birch covered the floor, pocketed by little communities of yews and apples and alders. There was very little space on the forest floor, and any paths they found had been made by wild boars, or deer maybe, and wolves were a constant threat. So travel was going to be slow and hard. So they decided to divide themselves into three groups, one man with each group. The first group was led by Bith, the father, and he decided that they should head north, and off they sat. The second group went east. They were led by Banba, the warrior woman, and Laura. And the last group, Ceasair's group, well, she stayed with her little brother, Fintan, and their group, well, they kind of made camp where they were. It wasn't too long for the first group to return without Bith. Bith had died from exhaustion, trying to look after all those women and trying to battle through that terrible temperate rainforest. And so the women were divided again, and half of Bith's women went to Banba and Laura. Banba and Laura were working their way through the jungle, and they had made it as far as Ardamine, present-day Wexford. And unfortunately, Laura, God love him, he essentially had 34 wives at this stage, and he was trying to keep them all satisfied while battling through that thick, dense woodlands. I'm sure it was too much for him. The heart gave out. He too was buried in Ardamine. The grave is still in Ardamine, actually. Very, very fittingly, right beside a very old graveyard. Well, the rest of the women now, those 34 women, returned to Ceasair and Fintan. Fintan had 50 women now to look after. 50 women on just by himself. So he did the only sensible thing a man like him could do, and he turned himself into a salmon. Yep, a salmon. And he swam away, probably hoping to live out his life in a nice river or a pond somewhere, you know, chilling out. Poor Ceasair, though. She was heartbroken. This hadn't meant to have been a journey of she was meant to save everybody on this journey, and they had lost so many people on the journey over. And then when they landed here, she'd lost her father and her brother, and now her youngest brother. Maybe he hadn't died, but he was a salmon, so he was as good as. And poor old Ceasair, well, she stopped eating, she stopped drinking water, and slowly she passed away. The remaining women on the island, whether through accident or age, they too passed away one by one, leaving one. The only one remaining was Banba, the warrior woman. Now at this point, Banba had become as wild as the island itself, and so made sense herself and Fintan the salmon might get together and might even hook up every now and then. Now the tales are a bit blurry, but it seems that maybe they had had children together. But it seems that Banba was not the most dedicated mother and let the children run wild on the island. Eventually those children got together themselves and had children, and then they had children, and then they had children, and they created their own tribe, a tribe that would be called the Fomorians. And they lived on small islands around the coast of Ireland, and they made their living, I suppose, if you want to call it that. By being sea pirates. They'd travel out and they'd hunt down any of the merchant ships that were cruising along the coast of France and Spain, and up around Scotland. A hard life, I'm sure. I did, of course, pass away eventually, but Fintan didn't. When Fintan grew tired of life as a salmon, he shifted again, this time into a hawk, and then a great stag. He lived hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and it was Fintan who witnessed the arrivals of the coming tribes. He lived long enough to pass on the stories, so we may have them today. So according to Fintan, once Ceasair's adventures came to an end, the island here lay uninhabited for hundreds of years. But their offspring, the Fomorians, well, they built up their settlements into camps, eventually kind of becoming small little villages, and they became very gifted shipmen. They were described, however, as horrible, grotesque monsters. It said that they had only one eye, one hand, and one foot. And sure, they could have been inbred enough, but what was really meant by that was that they had only one eye to covet, one eye to grab, and one foot to seize your properties. They stole everywhere, took goods, food, furs, and slaves as well. But eventually, a tribe arrived, brave enough to sail right into Fomorian territory and tried to settle here. They were led by a man called Porthos, who sailed from the eastern Mediterranean. And while here, they were said to have cleared 4 plains and created 7 lakes. And the old books also tell us that they were the ones to bring here cattle, milling, and even the brewing of beer. But of course, the Fomorians attacked them relentlessly, and weakened terribly, they eventually succumbed to a terrible plague. But before they died, the last remaining members of the tribe rose a standing stone on the plain they had cleared. Now, the stone is long gone, but the name remains. Is it perhaps the oldest place name in Ireland? Tavloch. Tav meaning plague and Lacht meaning grave or memorial stone. Today we call it Tala. Still by the same name, just anglicised. And it's a suburb of Dublin. Now the next tribe to attempt settling here were called the Numidians, led by a man called Nemed. He too had come from the Mediterranean, and they too fought the Fomorians. Many hard battles. They rarely won any, and they found themselves cruelly enslaved by those evil barbarians, forced to pay huge tribute to the Fomorians every year, 2/3 of everything they owned. Every Samhain, or as we call it today, Halloween, 2/3 of all the grain, 2/3 of all the milk and the cattle, and most heartbreakingly of all, 2/3 of all the children born that year must go to the Fomorians. Well, eventually the Numidians could take no more, and they rose up again, this time fighting a huge battle on the sea and on the land. It resulted in a lot of deaths on both sides, and only 30 of the Numidian tribespeople survived. They decided to split into 3 groups, because they couldn't decide what to do next. So one group, led by a guy called Britain, went to the bigger island, and he is the mutual descendant of all the native Britons, if there's any left, in England today. The next group went north, and they were not seen again for some time. The third group then, they sailed to the Mediterranean now, and on to Greece, back where they'd come from. But here, tragically, they were enslaved again. And for 200 years they worked as bagmen. Without Nemed, they had no name, and so they became known as the men of the belly bags, or the Fír Bolg. Every day they would walk together to the mountains and fill those huge sacks with fertile earth, and then carry them down the shore and empty the sacks out. They did this hour after hour, day after day, until the great mountains of Greece got a teeny little bit smaller, but became surrounded by lush, fertile green fields. Now, they'd always remembered Ireland. They'd always remembered the Isle of Banda as they knew it. And they always vowed that they would return one day. And eventually they managed to escape and did return to Ireland. But on approaching the island, they were beset by stormy weather, and their small little fleet became scattered, so they all had to enter the island on a different place. I'm here in Wexford, and the chieftain that led the boat that arrived in Wexford was a guy called Seanachai. And it's said that when Slania, when his boat came in and sailed up the river, he shouted out a claim that this land was his, and this river would forever be known by his name, Slania. And sure enough, all these years later, all these thousands of years later, we still call it after him. The name is slightly evolved. It's a Slaney now, but Slania, Slaney, doesn't matter. It was named after this brave Fír Bolg man. When they'd all got on land safely, though, they all reunited together in the centre of the island. And they agreed to divide it between the 5 chieftains among them, creating the 5 provinces that we still have today. And they also brought with them the idea that this land was like a goddess, and must be honoured as such. So fertile and lush and gorgeous was she. And the Fír Bolg, they managed to make sort of a peace with the Fomorians too. Now perhaps peace is too strong a word, but they simply refused the idea of paying a tax the same one their ancestors had to. So instead they traded and found other ways to make themselves useful, leaving the Fomorians happy to focus on the merchant ships, far more lucrative to them. And so time went on like this for 30, 40 years. A royal seat was established for the first time at the Hill of Tara. Crops were grown and harvested, children were born, and elders passed away. Structures were built, and the Fír Bolg prospered under their king, Oki Mathark. Life was good. But what of that group that travelled north? Well, they had done far more than prosper. Together, they had travelled to 4 great cities, meeting with wise men and receiving gifts and learning in each place. Ceasair the Wise, he resided in Morius, and here he gave them a cauldron that no one would ever step away from feeling unsatisfied. From Marius in Phalius, they received the Leafall, or the Stone of Destiny, a stone that would cry out when the rightful king placed his hand upon it. Still standing on the Hill of Tara today. Esdras in Gorius gave them a spear so sharp, so cool, it never missed its mark, no matter how chaotic the battle. And finally, from Uscius in Phineus, their leader Nuada received the Sword of Light. Once drawn, the enemy will be compelled to speak the truth, and no swordsman, no matter how deft in swordplay he or she might be, would win against it. They were also gifted in learning as well. The knowledge became very deep. They discovered a knowledge of medicine, healing, powerful magic, prophecy, the gift of writing and poetry, and the gift of stone and metal work, so that they might build great buildings and have the ability to defend them. They travelled for many centuries. Just as the Fír Bolg had been enslaved, they travelled. Each generation growing stronger and wiser and healthier and smarter and more beautiful and attractive to other tribes as a result. They'd even encountered the Fomorians at times on their travels. Well, these far-travelled Fomorians admired this strange tribe, and rather than fight, they kind of became seduced a bit, even having children with them and helping swell the numbers of this new strange tribe. They worshipped a mother goddess. They called her Danú, their mother. And so this soon became their new tribal name, the Tuatha De Danú, or the tribe or people of Danú. And then they were ready. They were ready to return to Ireland to finish their journey. It was the first day of summer when they arrived, the Eltma, 1st of May. Landing on ships made out of clouds, it said. Bress, their champion warrior, was the first to make contact as he went out to meet the Fír Bolg champion, Thrain. Now, no doubt they were very wary at first, but they soon realised they shared the same language, and I'm sure it was with great joy that they discovered that they shared ancestors. Bress warned Thrain that they had come to settle here, and asked if they could possibly maybe share the land. But Thrain explained that their journey home to Ireland had been so harsh and so difficult, the land was so hard won, with so many sacrifices made, that his king Oki Mathark would definitely refuse, and a battle would be fought. Bress, I'm sure, was disappointed, but he understood. Now they spent, the pair of them, a few hours by the campfire, sharing stories and food and a bit of wine. And Thrain and Bress did part as friends. As a gesture of solidarity and fairness, they swapped their weapons so the other could replicate them, so they'd be even on the battlefield. And they gave themselves adequate time too to prepare for battle. And then when they parted, I'm sure it was sadness, because the next time they met would definitely be at the end of each other's blades. Now it took a long time to prepare, but finally the day came. The great Battle of Moytura, as it would forever be known. It was near to Lake Corrib in Galway, was where they decided to meet, on a great plain, actually near where the town of Headford sits today. On one side, the Tuatha De Danú, led by their king Nuada, powerfully built man, exceptionally handsome too, with reddy blonde hair tied up in leather straps, and his eyes were said to have been as green as the spring grass. He was powerfully built, very strong, and considered to be a very calm and very wise man, with no love of bloodshed, but no fear of it either. And he stood there on the edge of that battlefield and surveyed the Fír Bolg calmly, without even a shadow of fear about him. Beside him stood his champion Bress, who was dressed for battle. His arms and torso and thighs were covered with strips of thick leather, a spear in one hand and a sword in the other. Now here's where the magic comes in, because they were flanked by the battle goddesses, Mauve and Bauv and Morrigan, their coal-black hair whipping in the wind, red war paint across their eyes, and they were singing the war song of their tribe. As they sang, they began to shapeshift, turning into huge black crows that swooped into the air, screaming out a terrifying screech. Behind the warriors was Jan Ceacht, the healer, busily adding magical healing herbs to that famous cauldron, ready for the coming injuries. On the far side stood the Fír Bolg. Their beloved King Oki MacArc stood brave and defiant, a huge cloak of wolf hides over his shoulders and a giant iron sword, unsheathed and waiting for battle. Beside him stood Thrain, boldly beating the hilt of his sword against his shield, taunting and rising the battle frenzy he needed to win the battle ahead. It galvanized the other men surrounding him, roaring and shouting insults toward his new enemy. The battle was short and brutal, and the Fír Bolg, well, they lost many, far more than the Tuatha De Danú. In the midst of the noise and the turmoil of the blood-sodden field, Thrain saw in horror Nuada raise his spear, the same one he'd received in Phineas, and he saw him fling it out over the fighting hordes. He saw it fly above the mass of fighting men and women, dodging and swerving as it flew straight into the heart of Oki MacArc. Without a thought, Thrain raised his sword, aiming for Nuada's heart, but he missed. He wounded him, though, badly too. He sliced his whole arm off from the elbow down. So with the Fír Bolg king dead on the field and the Tuatha De Danú king dangerously wounded, the battle was over. Over the next few days, the elders and advisors struck a deal. The island would be divided. The Tuatha De Danú were still happy to share the land, and the now much reduced tribe of Fír Bolg, well, they'd fought bravely and with honour. They could bury their king with pride and be given time to mourn and heal. The territory of Connacht would be theirs. The Tuatha De Danú would take the royal seat at Tara and rule the remainder of the island. Now, while the Tuatha De Danú had won, Nuada had been badly injured. The rule of the time was that no king could rule if he was injured or deformed in any way. And while the Fír Bolg had been defeated, they knew it was only a matter of time before the Fomorians came looking for blood. And so the kingship was handed over to Bress. Now this might have been unusual, but Bress was unusual himself in many ways. Unlike many tribal champions, Bress was known as Bress the Beautiful, and not in a sarcastic way either. He bore no great battle scars. He still had all of his eyes and ears. He was, in fact, stunningly handsome, perfect in every way. Tall, but not so tall he looked gangly, muscular, but not so that he looked like an old gnarled tree. His hair was thick and lustrous and hung from his head in rich mahogany flowing locks. His skin was tight, the colour of freshly tanned leather, without a mark, a scar, or a blemish anywhere. His jaw was strong, his cheekbones so sharp you could sharpen your knives on them, and his eyes sparkled blue like the sea on a summer's day, and it was said when he laughed, it was said to be so delightful that even the birds would flutter down to hear the sound. He'd inherited his looks from his mum, a woman by the name of Eru, the woman who would one day give this land her name. But don't let your first encounter with Bresson fool you. While he was respectful and diplomatic when he met Thrain, there was a cold ruthlessness within him. He could be cruel and dismissive and greedy, traits he inherited from his father. And this was important. His father was a Fomorian captain called Elatha. You see, Eru and Elatha had spent a very lazy, sexy summer's day together when they'd met by chance on the beach. And Elatha, unlike many of the Fomorians, was not a total troll, but actually rather handsome and certainly had the gift of the gab. Bress had never met his dad, but he knew how to find him if he ever needed him. Elatha had given Eru a magic ring, telling her that should he ever need him, to place the ring on Bress's finger and they would be transported through the air to his side. The need had never arisen, so Bress had been raised by his mother alone, and he even married another Tuatha De Danú woman, Breed, the midwife of the tribe. But it was this link with the Fomorians that made him holding the kingship so attractive to the elders. The Fomorians would surely never attack if one of their own sat on the throne. And so while poor El Nuada lay stricken in his bed, Jan Ceasair the healer attending to him, Bress was appointed king. Now they might have been better off just facing down the Fomorians on the battlefield, with or without Nuada, because Bress was not a good king. His true nature was laid bare very soon, and the Tuatha De Danú found themselves reduced to little more than his personal slaves. He hoarded all the food, the silver, the animal skins, the firewood, the milk, everything. He made the others work day and night, and despite the pleas of his mother and his wife, could not be softened. Even when he became a father himself, his miserly greed and selfishness remained. Now, out away from all of this drama at the court of Tara, there was a young warrior, one of the sons of Jan Ceasair the healer. Well, he was about to change things. Like all of the Tuatha De Danú, he was young and good-looking. He was dark-haired, with a mischievous smile and a glint in his eye, and had charmed his way into the beds of most of the women of the tribe. His name was Keen. Everybody loved Keen. Everyone did. Even though they knew they could count on him for little more than a night of pleasure. There was a collective graw for Keen. Even the elders and the old men who weren't interested in that way enjoyed his company, for he was light and silly, always ready with a story or a joke to tell, helping hand to draw the water or fix a post or even catch a chicken for them. So everyone was fierce fond of Keen. But Keen was bored. He had slept with every woman around, and he yearned for somebody new. His friends did nothing but slag him off and laugh at him, his handsome idiot. And then one night, while they were sitting around a campfire having a few beers, one of them made a suggestion, out of pure badness than anything else. He piped up with a story he'd heard from one of the Fír Bolg. While the Fomorians generally were a hideous and ugly lot, there were some who had been gifted with fine faces and fine figures, and it was said that the nastiest and ugliest of them all had sired the most beautiful and gentlest of them all. Balor of the Evil Eye had a daughter by the name of Ethna. She was so beautiful that he kept her locked up on a small island on the northwest coast, with 12 handmaidens and no men. Not only were there no men on this island, none of the women there had ever even seen a woman, or seen a man, except for Balor, and the small entourage of warriors that went everywhere with him, but they were as ugly as he was. And Cian loved a good challenge, and this was simply perfect for him. But before we go on, I need to let you, the listener, know a little background to this Balor fellow. You see, Balor is going to play a big role in the story ahead. His father had been a middling chieftain within the Fomorians, powerful but not overly so. Balor had grown up in one of the smaller encampments, but his father was an ambitious man and asked the druids of the settlement to create for him some dark magic so that he might become more powerful. Balor, then a small child, was a nosy, annoying little brat He was the kind that pulls legs off spiders, takes the ball home when he's not winning, you know the type. Well, despite being told to make himself scarce, he'd done the complete opposite. He climbed up onto the roof of the Druid's hut, intending to watch their magic, as he arrogantly felt he could recreate it alone later. But the very moment he looked down into the hole in the thatch, a cloud of purpley black smoke rose up, engulfing his fat little face and eyes. He fell to the ground, screaming in agony. The Druids and others clustered around him. He was brought to his father's house and laid out on the bed. And the Druids created poultices and placed them over his eyes, wrapping them in bandages, whispering incantations over him until his screams eventually softened down into whispers. It wasn't clear if the child would make it through the night. But when the dawn broke, he sat up, still wearing the bandages around his eyes, and complained that he was hungry. After a bowl of broth, the Druids began their work, slowly unravelling the material, catching the now dried out herbs from each layer as they unwrapped and unwrapped until his face was bare. His mother and his aunt screamed. One fainted. His father turned and vomited. You see, where once he had two admittedly piggy little eyes, they had merged together, merged into one hateful, horrible, evil eye, oozing pus and blood. And though it was Balor's eye, it seemed too that like a darkness looked out from that black centre, an evil no one could describe. The Druid's dark magic was in that eye. And sure enough, as the years passed, Balor went from annoying and nasty to downright cruel and evil. He discovered that he could use that power hidden in the eye. The evil darkness was at his bidding. All Balor had to do was raise the deformed eyelid, and anything he looked at withered, aged and sickened, sometimes even dying, be it a plant, an animal or a person. And with his evil eye, Balor quickly risen through the ranks, and was now probably the most powerful of all the Fomorians. But the more he used that eye, the more powerful it became. And so now he kept the eye hidden, unless it was needed, of course. Hidden under 3 patches, one of leather, one of iron, and one of silver. And Balor had also been given a warning. He was given this warning when he was a young man, almost of age. The most senior of all his father's Druids came to him with a prophecy. Balor, he said, your grandson will be the man who will end your life. So if you want to die old and in your bed, never, ever sire a child. While Balor had had many encounters over the years, well, he'd taken that prophecy to heart, and he was very careful. Oh, if a woman was unlucky enough to become pregnant by him, well, they were killed well before the child was born. Well, almost all of them. All until Ethna, because Ethna's mother had escaped, and the baby had survived. And as cold and as dark as his heart was, it must have melted when he finally found them and saw Ethna lying in the crib. Something about her prevented him from killing her. The mother, Godlover, was killed, of course, and the baby, well, she was brought to an island, along with a handful of other orphaned girls to keep her company. And that is where she remained, almost 20 years later. She'd been trapped. She'd never seen any man, other than Balor and his ancient, battle-scarred, ugly assistants. They were the ones who delivered food and clothing and goods, and even gifts from time to time. After all these years, Balor rarely visited anymore, but when he did, he was charmed enough by her again, and refused to do what the Druids advised. That is, cut her throat and protect yourself, man. And so back to Cian. And you can now see why this potential dalliance might be so significant. Cian, on hearing about this island filled with women, had done his research, quickly discovered its location, and he asked MacMahon MacLear, another man of the Tuatha De Danú, one who had the power to control the seas, to lend him his boat, the Wave Sweeper. Ethna and her sisters, as she called them, on this particular day were sitting outside. It was high summer, one of those days when little gets done and no one cares because it's hot and sticky and all that really matters is cooling down. They were lying under a tree on the soft grass. doing nothing, just watching the swallows swoop in and out from under the eaves of the thatched roof of their small communal feasting hall. Each girl had her own little small circular thatched building that surrounded it. Off to one side there was a small patch of apple trees, where the chickens were pecking about in the dust, and the goats were all asleep in their small little paddock, too hot to pay any attention to the delicious-looking fresh sheets drying on the gorse bushes. Bored, hot, and bored. You can only imagine their thoughts and faces when they saw Cian emerge from the turf, like something from a cheesy romance novel. Picture him now. Think of Daniel Craig and James Bond, walking barefoot up onto the sands. His legs were powerful and strong, splashed with seawater, slightly tanned by the summer sun, wearing a pale green tunic with felt just above his knees, trimmed with purple embroidery and a soft calfskin belt which hung on a scabbard, the knife hilt glinting in the sun. A little leather pouch bouncing lightly from his hip as he walked. Around his neck a string of small little amber beads, his shoulders broad but not quite as powerful as they hinted they would one day become. His hair was a dark coppery brown, highlighted with shades of a lighter red, which had loose curls around his shoulders, a small, thin gold headband keeping it off his face. What a face! He smiled at the women as they drank him in, and when he smiled, his whole face lit up, his bright green eyes twinkling in anticipation. I won't bore you with the details of what followed in the next few days. I'll just say that all involved had a wonderful time. The women were schooled in Cian's talents, and Cian's uncompromised appetite for the opposite sex was finally sated for once. Cian remained on the island for weeks. Without doubt, the tales of Etna's beauty and character had been understated. She really was something very special. She was tall, with sun-bleached blonde hair falling down her back, almost reaching her thighs. Was she loosely braided in ribbons, flowers? She was full-bodied and curvaceous, with deep dark blue eyes. And she was, to Cian's delight, funny, sharp-witted, and while initially a little wary and shy, she was soon sparring easily with him, teasing and flirting with ease. But Cian was conscious that his absence might be noted on the mainland. He was well aware of Bress's compulsion for strange and nasty punishments, and as the days passed, he worried his continued disappearance might cause trouble for his friends, even his family members. And so he decided ultimately that he should return home. And so it was with lots of sighs and tears and wringing of hands that Cian set sail with his tiny little boat, headed back to the coast of Ireland. It was almost a year later that Balor at last returned to that little island to visit his daughter. What a shock that awaited him. As they pulled their boat up onto the sands, all looked normal. But on approaching the little settlement, they were confronted with line after line of cotton nappies drying in the wind and the unmistakable sound of babies crying. As they entered the main communal house, it quickly became clear that every woman on the island was now a mother, each one holding a little bundle. Balor's rage was clear, it was quick, it was brutal. As the women screamed and begged and pleaded, each baby was ripped from their arms and thrown into a rough sack. If Balor's men felt the deed was distasteful, they just said nothing. They just went about their work, for fear of this man's sheer and utter rage. They averted their eyes as he beat and whipped the women fighting for their children's lives, but thankfully that horrid eye remained closed all the while. Then the men brought the sacks down to the water's edge, and they flung them out onto the churning waves of the Atlantic, where they'd surely drown. But the women's screams had been heard. MacMahon MacLear, the same one who had the power over the waters, he heard their wails and screams and shrieks of terror, and he acted quickly. Pulling each child from the sacks, he used his magic to transform each child into a small animal capable of surviving the sea. Their descendants still live on. Today, we call them seals. When he found the final child, however, a baby boy, he somehow knew, he felt this child was special, different from the others. Satisfied the other children would survive, he whisked this little baby away, down the coast and into Connacht, where he found the Fír Bolg settlement. MacLear took the baby to Tailtu, the widow of the Fír Bolg king, Ochi MacArt. She was good, kind and patient, talented and quiet farmer. She was now living alone, but in a fine settlement, and still awarded the protection of the Fír Bolg warriors should she need them. And she agreed to take the child on as a foster child, to rear him with love, and when he came of age, to send him to Tara. We don't know what became of Etna and the other women. Her and their story ends here, but her son's does not. The boy was named Lou, and from the beginning he was unusual to say the least. By the time he was 3, he had the look of a much older boy. By 7, he had the look of a young man, and by the time he was 10, he was fully grown. I know, mad, but bear with me. No skill was too difficult for him to learn. He mastered it all. Hurling, chess, hunting, fighting, silversmithing, the horse racing, blacksmithing, them all. Tailtu, his foster mother, was so proud of this little boy that she'd raised. She'd realised early on that the boy was almost godlike and not meant to stay with her for long. And so as soon as he'd mastered the art of charioteering, she sent him to Tara, telling him that this was where his destiny lay. And so off he went. Now, while all of that was going on, much had been happening at Tara. Nuada, the first king, well, he was still alive. His physician, Jan Kiat, had worked hard to keep him that way. Balms and poultices, they had stemmed the bleeding and almost healed the stump. The silversmith, Credney, had created a beautiful silver arm, one that worked just as a real arm would. It allowed Nuada to hold onto a cup, pull on the reins of a horse, even hold a sword, if not fight with it, but it wasn't enough to restore the kingship on him. While the silver arm worked very well, his own arm was more troublesome. It stubbornly refused to completely heal. Now, Nuada had been much loved by his tribe. As I mentioned in the intro, he was uncommonly wise. He was very kind and very fair. And it was under Nuada's reign that they had returned to Ireland and won the land, a journey they had planned and talked about for years before they finally made it. And the years under Bressa's rules, well, that had been very different. The people were literally hungry, exhausted and depressed. But 2 events were about to happen which would quickly change the fate of Bressa's kingship. The first event was this. Miach and Ermid, the younger brother and sister of Cian, all the children of Jan Kiat, the healer, came of age, and they had a plan. Miach had found where Nuada's arm had been buried and dug it up. He did this without their father's permission. You see, Jan Kiat, while being a great physician and healer, doesn't seem to have been the most encouraging father. For one thing, he raised a son with serious commitment issues. But more importantly, Miach had a gift for healing unlike any seen before and was determined to heal Nuada back to full health, restoring his arm to his body. But Jan Kiat, maybe he was fearful it would overshadow his own abilities, maybe he didn't believe Miach was able to do it, but whatever, he forbid Miach to even try. But Miach, well, he did. Ermid, his sister, gathered certain herbs, and Miach began his healing on the now rotting stump. They wrapped it in scented cloths, filled with different special herbs, botanicals that Ermid had created. And Miach held the stump close to his own body. For 3 days and 3 nights he sang incantations to it. Again. Sinew to sinew, nerve to nerve, muscle to muscle, flesh to flesh, be whole again. And slowly the flesh began to grow around the bones. And on the end of the 3rd day the arm was indeed whole again. And so the 2 set off to Nuada's house, the arm with them. When they arrived, they could hear Nuada groaning from inside. But an older servant was sitting at the door and he wouldn't let them in. When they told the old servant who they were and why they were there, more importantly, he pointed to his eye and he said, "I lost this at the Battle of Moytura. If you can make me see again, I'll believe you and I'll let you pass." Well, Miach had noticed a cat on their approach. Miach was obviously like myself. I always notice a cat whenever I'm out and about. If there's one, I'll find it. And he returned to find the cat asleep by the campfire. Very gently, he stroked it, and with strange movement his fingers passed over the cat's head, and popped out its eye without the cat even noticing. He ran back to the old guard and did the same thing to the man, sweeping his hands over the old man's head and eye. And then there was a pop, and a moment later the man was blinking, a new cat's eye in his head, fully able to see everything again. Oh, he was delighted with himself, and he allowed them to enter. Now, there's just a little side story, though, about this poor man, because it was said he was delighted to have his full sight returned. He was forever tormented with that eye, as it retained its cat's nature. And when the man wanted to sleep at night, the cat's eye was always looking out for mice, while he could hardly be kept awake during the day. Anyway, back to the story. So, Ermid and Miach entered Nuada's sleeping chamber. The first thing they noted was a deeply unpleasant smell. All around the silver arm, the stump was beginning to fester. The poor man, poor Nuada, he had lost so much weight, he was barely recognisable from the powerful warrior king that they'd last seen him as. Miach moved fast. He was very conscious of his dad bursting in at any time, checking on his patient. And so they removed the beautiful silver arm. They cleaned the wound and bound his original arm to the stump. They bandaged it with yet more magical herbal pastes on each layer, and then bound it again to Nuada's own chest, and Miach began to sing the song again. Sinew to sinew, nerve to nerve, muscle to muscle, flesh to flesh, be whole again. Now, it had taken 3 days and nights for the arm to heal. How long would it take to get it attached back to his body? He didn't know, but he kept singing. Sinew to sinew, nerve to nerve, muscle to muscle, flesh to flesh, be whole again. And as he sang, he was joined by somebody. The Morrigan and her sisters, Mauve and Bob. Silently, they had drifted into the room to watch what was going on. These powerful war goddesses, they too had the power of healing. Different, harsher healing perhaps, like when life beats you down to your knees, but you find healing through humanity and you emerge a better person. They were eerie and unpredictable, but they loved their king. They despised Bress, and they would do anything they could to help Nuada heal. And so they began to join in, singing Miach's chant with him over and over. Sinew to sinew, nerve to nerve, muscle to muscle, flesh to flesh, be whole again. Their power added to Miach's, speeding up the recovery, but still it took all night. However, as the dawn broke, Nuada was healed. His arm, despite a teeny little scar, no bigger than a freckle, was as it was before. Now, when Jian Kiak discovered what had happened, he did not take it well. Turns out he was just jealous, and his jealousy turned up into a toxic red mist. He found Miach out walking, and he attacked him. He struck poor Miach on the head with a cudgel. For the first time he did it, he broke the skin, but Miach was able to heal himself. He hit him again then, this time breaking the bone, but again Miach killed himself. On the third strike, however, he meant business. He cleaved straight into Miach's brain, killing him instantly. Poor old Miach. He was buried where he fell, and in the days that followed, his heartbroken sister Ermid stayed by the grave. She refused to leave it. After a day or so, she noticed that herbs were beginning to grow from the upturned earth. And she noticed how they were growing, almost like a shadow of the body that lay beneath. She realized that Miach was sending her his knowledge, his wisdom, magical healing. His knowledge of the herbs. Before his eyes, or where his lies lay, grew calendula. Below his heart, chamomile. At his liver, some dandelions, and so on and so on. When they were finished growing, she carefully laid out her cloak, picking each one, noting what it was and what area of the body it treated. But Jian Kiak wasn't finished. Still angry, still poisoned with begrudgery and spite, he picked up the cloak and threw the herbs to the wind, her healing properties only being found again now. Now that was the first event. The second event is this. There is another law, another of the ancient laws, that was upheld just as strongly as the law of an unblemished king. That is the law of hospitality. Tradition dictates in this country that when a visitor comes to your door, you feed them, you offer them a drink and a good night's rest. And this is done in exchange for stories and songs and entertainment on part of the visitor. It was a rule that continued in this land long after that time, right up until almost today, really. Maybe with the end of television and hotels, it started to end. But Bress had been honoured with a visit from Carbra, the poet, powerful storyteller. Don't let anyone tell you that words are less powerful than the sword. When Carbra visited the house of Bress, he arrived in Tara expecting a nice meal, a few beers, a bit of a session around the fire with some storytelling and poetry from himself, and a nice room to crash out in afterwards. What he got, however, was quite the opposite. And he left very early the next morning. And as he walked away, he delivered the first satire in Ireland, words that would condemn Bress, words that would strip him of his power and end his rule, and they went like this. Food to his table, sparse and late, wood wide about the plate. May his tongue be as dry as he left me. May his best drink be skimmed milk, stolen from the calf. No guests by firelight nor by day. May his wealth half, and half again, until he has not even enough to pay the storyteller. May this be my parting gift to Bress. Well, this caused Bress's fortunes to change very dramatically, to be the subject of such vicious satire, so horrible blemishes break out all over his perfect little face of his chest, his arms, his legs, everywhere. And as you know, an imperfect king could not rule. His servants and his entourage fled, abandoning him. The guards turned their back on him, and he was left crying to his mammy. It was at that point his mammy gave him the ring his father Elatha had given him so long ago. She felt he needed to get out of here before things got too messy, and she put the ring on his finger, and he disappeared from the court of Tara and reappeared in his father's Fomorian camp. Elatha didn't have much sympathy for him, though. Well, he gave out to him for wasting his opportunity, losing his position. He had been king, for God's sake. And, worst of all, he'd embarrassed his mother. He said there was no way he was going to help him. And if he was any other man, he deserved little else than to spend the rest of his days out wandering the roads begging. But, as Bress was his son, he would do this much. He would give him permission to go to Balor, as Balor had plans. Bress may have been of use to him as a foot soldier or something. And so, as Lugh was heading to Tara, Bress headed to Balor. And that was the end of the second event. When Lugh reached Tara, he'd arrived a few days after Nuada had been reinstated by the king, or as the king rather, and great celebrations had been held. All the stores of food and beer Bress had hidden away had been opened up and shared till everyone had their fill and then some more. The result being that they were all suffering from a bit of a hangover, really, even a few days later. And so when that young, cocky Lugh showed up, the guard at the gate wasn't really in the mood for him. The conversation went a little like this. I demand an entrance to the courts of Tara and an audience with Nuada. Oh, really? Who might you be? I am Lugh, son of Keen, son of Ethna, grandson of Balor, foster son of Tailtu. Oh, you know. Well, no one gets in without a trade or a skill, so what can you do? I'm a warrior. Yeah, we've loads of them. I'm a musician. Yeah, we've loads of them too. I'm a smith. What type? And before you answer, we have a blacksmith, we've got a silversmith, and we have a goldsmith too. Oh, okay, well, I am all three of those, but I'm also a charioteer. We have a lot of them. Okay, I'm a healer. We have a healer. His name is Jankyak. You don't want to get on the wrong side of him. I'm a master chess player. There's more than a few in here that would make claim to that too. But this went on until some time, until eventually Lugh said, okay then, have you got anybody with all the skills I have? One person with all of these skills? The guard was a bit stumped at that, and probably getting bored of the game himself. He let him in. Probably more to get rid of him than anything. He let him in. Once inside, Lugh immediately made his way to the great hall and sat down at the sage's seat, a place honoured for the wisest man or woman. Of course, this drew a lot of questions, and then in turn, challenges. And Lugh found himself having to prove to everyone that all the claims he'd made were true. Playing chess, throwing flagstones, crafting weapons, carving goblets, the lot. Until he was finished, and Nuada stepped up. Nuada then made an announcement that shocked them all. He declared that this young man, Lugh, would forevermore be known as Lugh an Ildana, master of all the crafts, and that he was just the person needed to shut down the Fomorians once and for all. Because surely that's where Bress has gone, and he'll definitely be back sooner rather than later. And Nuada, as the king, felt that it was appropriate for him to step down and to let this younger, vastly talented young man step up and finish the job. You can only wonder what Seanachai thought about it. But anyway, the Tuatha De Danú, they agreed. And so they got busy. Lugh Tain the carpenter set to making shields and lance shafts. Crednay the bronze worker made rivets for the lances and the hilts for the swords and the rims and bosses for the shields. Govnu the smith got busy making lances and swords. Cabra started posing more powerful satyrs. And Seanachai got busy making healing potions for the battle injuries for the rest of the men and women. And everybody else, including Nuada, began to train and prepare. Nuada probably had a little bit more to do catch-up-wise, but he worked hard, and then finally the day of the battle dawned, forevermore known as the Second Battle of Moytura. From the west, it was said that the sea was black with ships, with war drums beating a heavy rhythm. The sky was filled with dark foreboding clouds hanging low over the land. The atmosphere was electric, just like that before a terrible storm. They'd marched to a remote plain, Carrowkeel and Sligo, and that is where the Fomorian army stood strong, seemingly indestructible. There was not a chief nor a skilled warrior among them without armour against his skin, a helmet on his head, a broad, sharp spear in one hand, and a heavy, sharp sword in the other. Their shields, they locked them together, so it was one impenetrable wall. This is what greeted the Tuatha De Danú as they arrived over the hills of the land. But they too were ready. Their hand defiant. Their newly made weapons glinted in the dull sunlight, filed to a point as they sharp as broken glass. Row after row of men and women, clad in armour of thick black leather, reinforced with iron and silver, so it seemed almost like they were living lightning below the storm clouds in the sky above. And in that sky, above their heads, flew the Morrigan and her sisters, the huge black crows, screeching and screaming again as they swooped over the battlefield, taunting the Fomorians. The Dagda, the greatest warrior the Tuatha De Danú had, stood with his great club hung over his shoulder, and Nuada beside him. Nuada's arm, well, now fully restored, he flexed his muscles in his shoulders, rolling them forwards and back, relishing the surge of adrenaline before battle. He had worked hard to be there. And in front of them all stood Lugh. His blonde hair had been tied back with leather strips off his face. He was wearing a sturdy, polished helmet, inlaid with delicate golden enamelling. And he wore a silver chainmail vest, and over it a breastplate of polished gold. His shield too was painted in reds and golds. His jaw was set in a look of grim determination, his hazel-coloured eyes set on the enemy ahead. By now, he too had discovered the story of the prophecy. Lugh knew that he was the one who was going to kill Balor. He knew that it was going to be today or never at all. And he didn't know, though, whether he would survive or not. But that didn't matter. Not now, nor at any time. For Lugh was a hero, and heroes have destinies. He would kill Balor and put an end to the Fomorian threat forever. And as the clouds broke above him, a beam of light came down and it hit him, lighting him up, making him shine like the sun. And then they saw him, Balor. He was standing to the back of the Fomorians. but not out of fear or anything like that. He had changed. The tiny piece of humanity that had been inside, that small part of his dark, evil heart that had kept Etna alive, was gone. And when it died, the dark magic that had taken his eye and turned him into a living weapon had taken over. He seemed to have grown. He stood as tall as 3 men. His head was huge, it was swollen, and his face distorted. An evil grin lay under the eye patch, which now took over most of his face. The patch was too heavy for Balor to lift himself now. Instead, it took a team of men to lift it away, using a huge ship's chain. No one knew what destruction that eye was capable of now. And standing there beside him, dwarfed by the great heap of evil that was Balor, cowardly, smirking Bress. Cowardly might be a bit strong. Say what you want about Bress, but he had been the champion warrior of the Tuatha De Danú. He wasn't afraid of a fight, even if it meant killing those he called his friends and family. So let's call him Shleevini Smirking Bress. With a roar from Balor, the Fomorians advanced and the battle began. It was brutal. Blur of bodies and screams and shouts and thuds and cries. Jan Kiat worked tirelessly, taking the poor people who had been pulled bleeding, dying off the battlefield. He would throw their bodies into a pit which had been filled with healing waters, and some like macabre conveyor belt, they would climb out fully restored and return to the fight. The Dagda, well, he just walked through the walls of Fomorians, his giant club effortlessly brushing down his challengers like a giant toddler with a stick walking past a flower bed. And Lou stood in the centre of it all, ruthlessly cutting and slicing and dicing, desperately trying to reach Balor. Above him, those 3 huge crows, watching his back, attacking the flesh of anyone who tried to throw a javelin his way or swing their sword at his back. It wasn't too long before the Fomorians were in trouble. Many of them lay dead on the field. Still more were fighting with damaged or broken weapons. Their shafts had broken and shields had split, and the Tuatha De Danú advanced on. Pulling his sword from the body of a fallen Fomorian, Lou turned and found himself face to face with a battered, bleeding and badly injured Bress. Bress fell to his knees, about to beg for forgiveness now the battle was turning, but before he could say a word, Lou plunged his sword into Bress's chest, killing him instantly. Suddenly there was a shout. Panic amidst the confusion of the battle. The Fomorians began to run. At first the Tuatha De Danú fighters thought they were deserting. Yay, we won the battle. But then they saw the commotion was caused by something else. Something far more terrifying than they were. The Fomorians were running away. The order had been given. Balor's evil eye was opening. It was truly terrible. The iris was a huge, deep, dark red, surrounded by the pupil, colour of fire with flecks of a sickly bright green. And it moved lazy-like in Balor's head. It focused then on a small group of men and women who had been fighting. 3 Tuatha De Danú and 2 Fomorians. They just stood there, frozen in the midst of the fight, like foxes caught in a torchlight, unable to move. As Balor's eye found them, though, their skin began to redden and blister, and they screamed out, a terrible, ugly scream, unlike anyone they had heard before. And the red, blistered skin began to blacken and then fade to grey, and then they just turned to ashen figures and disappeared in a cloud of dust. At this, the battle was forgotten. Panicked warriors from both sides ran for cover. Some made it, others didn't. Balor didn't care who he hit, Fomorian or Tuatha De Danú. Maybe it was the dark magic within him. But he laughed in triumph as yet another man was caught in his line of sight, turning to dust too. Oh, it was an evil, repulsive laugh, full of spite and bitterness. And where was Lou? Well, he'd stripped off his helmet and his breast shields and discarded his weapons, and he stood there in the centre of the battlefield. In one hand, a small, handmade catapult. In the other, well, there was nothing. His hand was outstretched and waiting for Morrigan. She flew down and dropped a large stone into his waiting hand. Just as Balor turned to look at Lou, terrible iris beginning to focus, he aimed and shot. The stone flew through the air and hit Balor right in the centre of his eye. It hit the eye at such force that it spun the eye around, and it burst through the back of Balor's head, the last of the magic within it, just powerful enough to destroy the remaining Fomorians that had run behind Balor to hide from the eye. Balor collapsed to his knees and then fell backwards. Dead. The battle was over. The Fomorians had been defeated, and the Tuatha De Danú would rule Ireland. And rule they did, for hundreds of years. There's many more tales to tell about their adventures. Cian and Lugh did eventually enjoy some father and son time, but Cian found himself in trouble again and was eventually killed by 3 brothers avenging their sister's honour. MacMahon and MacLear's grandnephews and niece would be turned into swans by a wicked stepmother. Lugh would fight off a Greek warrior and a sorceress called Carmen and her 3 sons. After he killed the boys, she drowned in a lake of her own tears, still remembered in the Irish name for Wexford, Loch Carmen. But one day, from Spain, there came a new tribe, just as the Numidians and the Partholians and the Fír Bolg had come. This tribe were called the Sons of Mill, Milesians, and all native Irish today are descended from this tribe, who would later be known as the Celts. This time there was no great battle. There were some arguments and a bit of a kerfuffle on the beach, but eventually an agreement was reached. They would split the land in half between them. The Tuatha De Danú would use their magic to take the land beneath the land, and the Sons of Mill would take the land above. And don't go feeling sorry for the Tuatha De Danú, they were very weary of this place by then. The other world was also known as Tir na Nog, the land of the young, an amazing place where no one ever grows old. Rivers run with honey and beer, trees are heavy with fruit all year round, and everyone lives in an endless, perfect summer's day. The Celts, in exchange, would honour the Tuatha De Danú as the gods of this land. They promised not to touch the old home places, and the places of worship, and they would leave them to become the hidden mounds we know today. Newgrange, Louth and Douth, Fornox, Roughcrowan, many, many more. They would give offerings at deep water wells, and the Celts would honour them at Samhain and at Bealtaine, Imbolc and Lunasa. And they would call the land Eru, as she herself had requested. And so, on Samhain Eve, 3,000 years ago, the Tuatha De Danú gathered on the hill of Usnach in County Meath, and departed to the other world through a magical doorway that still lies hidden beneath the great catstone boulder that still stands there today. Celts kept their word. They did indeed worship them as gods. Lugh became the sun god, worshipped at the harvest. And poor Elbreed, who'd watched her son die in the Second Battle of Moythora, she became a mother goddess, aiding women giving birth, along with many more skills such as beer making, blacksmithing and fire, and she's still honoured today, St. Bridget today though. MacMahon and MacLear became the god of the sea, and the Morrigan was last said to have appeared above the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. And so this is where our tale ends tonight. This is where I leave you now to contemplate. With the arrival of Christianity, the Tuatha De Danú may have lost their status as gods, but they were kept alive in folk memory as the She of the land, the fairy people. Their festivals evolved into saints' days. Samhain became All Hallows' Eve. Imbolc became St. Bridget's Day. And the mounds were avoided not out of a respect for the old gods anymore, but for a fear you might disappear into the land of the She. Now some scholars will tell you by digging deeper into the story you can see the arrival of enlightenment. Balor and the Fomorians representing our primitive and primordial existence before the arrival of farming and religion and civilization, and who knows, perhaps they're right. But what's more important, to me anyway, you've just heard a story that has been told and retold again countless times over the last few thousand years. Now think for a moment now. Just how many lines of ancestors does that go back for you? And how many of them heard the same story, albeit told a little differently? Now, it's time for the lather. Thank you very much for joining me.